Hello, and welcome to Obscure Fare, the podcast dedicated to the study of humanity's lesser-known attempts to kill each other. In this, my first episode, we'll be covering the Battle of Khambula, an engagement in the latter part of the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, where a small but heavily armed British Imperial force under the command of Colonel Evelyn Wood will face off against roughly 21,000 Zulu warriors. This is a two-part episode. This section will deal with the prelude and background to the battle, including the smaller Battle of Hlobane, and the second section will cover the battle itself. Before we start, I'd like to make a note on nomenclature. I'm afraid to say I will almost certainly butcher quite a few Zulu words in this episode, a fact for which I sincerely apologise. As a result, where possible, I will use the English words for most places, but I'll always use the Zulu words when referring to Zulu things, like kraals or assegais, and I won't be using the anglicised forms for Zulu people's names. I found this to be a good balance for making the episode understandable to an audience without neglecting the Zulu point of view or whitewashing the situation. I apologise in advance, though, for my many pronunciation errors. So let's get started. Now, I shan't cover in any length the causes or roots of the Anglo-Zulu War, because they're complicated, contentious, and they don't add a whole lot to our narrative here. But if it is a subject of interest to you, I highly recommend the book Zulu by Saul David. He goes into far more detail than I ever could. But to put it simply, the Zulu War was an attempt by the British administration in South Africa to dismantle the Zulu hegemony along the eastern coast of the modern-day state of South Africa. The British, under the general leadership of the High Commissioner for South Africa, Sir Henry Bartle Frere, had demanded the dismantling of the Zulu military system for over a decade at this point. The Zulus had understandably refused. They were a fundamentally martial nation, and, as the revenue of the Zulu king relied on the unpaid labour of his conscripted menfolk, rather than any kind of tax system, the removal of the Zulu military would be tantamount to a removal of the Zulu state. As tensions rose during the 1870s, despite the King Cetshwayo's desire for peace, they came to a head in early 1879, when the sons and warriors of a Zulu border chief called Shihayo crossed into British territory to recapture and put to death two of Shihayo's runaway wives. This was the straw that broke the camel's back, and a month later war had broken out, with 3 columns of British troops crossing into Zululand and burning Shihayo's kraal being the Zulu word for a village or homestead. The British had under their control some 16,000 men, 6,600 white redcoat regiments and about 9,000 black levies recruited from the Natal natives and some loyal Zulus. Opposing them was the Zulu military machine, between 35 and 50,000 warriors, well drilled and armed with light cowhide shields and 2 types of spear, the longer throwing spear and the shorter stabbing spear, or assegai. This formidable weapon, as anyone who's ever played Civilization 6 will tell you, was also known as an ikulwa, named for the sound it made when pulled from a wound. It is also important to note that a great many Zulus were in possession of firearms, mostly obsolete muskets and muzzle-loading rifles traded to them by the Portuguese at Delagoa Bay. They were, however, to put it frankly, terrible shots. A combination of poor training and a misconception about how scopes worked made them very poor marksmen indeed, but I'll cover the armaments of British troops in a little while. The Zulu troops were organised into a series of amabutho, or regiments, based on their age. These regiments, usually comprising about 1,500 men, although there was a wide variation, lived communally in a military kraal or amakanda for their first 8 months of service to undergo basic training. For the remainder of their lives, these warriors would spend 3 months of the year serving in the amakandas, and the rest of their time returning to their homes. This gave the Zulu state an enormous body of trained reservists that could be called up at a moment's notice, and, as the warriors would spend their 3-month service working for the king, allowed the state to function in the absence of a taxed central bureaucracy. Zulu warriors had to get permission from the king in order to wear the isikoko, or head ring, a woven grass circlet that was sewn into the hair and which elevated the warrior to a higher social position and allowed him to marry. The isikokos were generally given to the regiments of older warriors, usually at around 40 years of age, the theory behind this being that it kept the young and rash men under the control of the king, and ensured they would stay loyal, with the carrot of marriage and the stick of execution both being utilised liberally. The Zulu Army in 1879 contained, according to a report written by F.B. Finney, a border agent from southern Natal, 33 Amabutho, 18 older, more experienced married regiments who carried white shields, and 15 younger, unmarried regiments carrying black shields. It is important to note, however, that 7 of the married regiments were composed of men over 60 who were not deployed in battle. This left, so Finney estimated, 26 Amabutho ready for battle, a force of 40,400 men. The British invasion of Zululand was conducted by 3 columns, although the original plan had been for 6, hence the confusing column numbers. The number 1 column was led by Colonel Charles Pearson, the commanding officer of the 3rd Regiment of Foot. His column crossed the Tukela River from Natal into Zululand on the 12th of January, and would soon become trapped in a siege at the Norwegian mission station of Ashoe. Number 3 column was led nominally by the commander of the 24th Regiment of Foot, Colonel Richard Glynn, but since the overall commander of the invasion, the ineffectual Lord Chelmsford, also accompanied this column, he took control of most of the decision-making. They crossed the Buffalo River into Zululand at the infamous Rorke's Drift on the 9th, and would very quickly suffer one of the worst military defeats in British history at Isandlwana. The column we are interested in, however, is number 4 column, under the command of the aforementioned Colonel Evelyn Wood, who crossed the Blood River into Zululand on the 6th of January. Wood's men may not have known it yet, but it was their great fortune to be led by 2 of the most able officers in the British Army. Wood himself and his deputy, Lieutenant Colonel Redvers Buller, were both protégés of the renowned military reformer, Sir Garnet Wolseley. Wood was a short, balding man with doleful eyes and a large, unruly beard. He suffered, moreover, from partial deafness, and was a rather sickly man, suffering in his childhood from such conditions as typhoid, pneumonia, and chronic indigestion. He had also, rather amusingly, been kicked in the face by a giraffe. His uninteresting appearance, however, belied his professional talents, and when he spoke his sharp mind and ready wit were at once apparent. Queen Victoria wrote of him, quote, "He is clever and amusing, and all he says is very interesting." End quote. Additionally, his military career had been nothing short of extraordinary. Born in 1838 as the son of an Essex vicar, he enlisted as a midshipman in the Navy at the age of 14. 2 years later he was serving with the Naval Brigade in the Crimean War, most notably taking part in the failed assault on Redan, where he left his sickbed accompanied by a sailor nurse, and was the only man of his entire column to reach the Russian lines unscathed. Once there, he was badly wounded in the arm, and barely escaped capture by crawling back to the British lines at nightfall. After convincing an army surgeon not to amputate his wounded arm, he was offered a commission in the 13th Light Dragoons, although he quickly transferred to the 17th Lancers in order to serve in the Indian Mutiny. Once there, he earned the Victoria Cross for, quote, "attacking single-handedly a body of mutineers whom he routed." End quote. It was at this point, after shuttling between various infantry regiments, qualifying as a barrister, and graduating from Staff College, that he was spotted by Wolseley, who selected the now brevet lieutenant colonel to serve in his upcoming Ashanti expedition, which we shall cover in a future episode. Wood impressed Wolseley by leading a regiment of coastal tribesmen on a difficult march across rough terrain straight to the Ashanti capital of Kumasi, although he suffered a near-fatal bullet wound in the process. In 1878, whilst in South Africa, he was assigned to the staff of the newly arrived Lord Chelmsford, then Sir Frederick Thesiger, although I'll continue to call him Chelmsford to avoid confusion. He served ably alongside Redvers Buller in the many Cape Frontier Wars, earning the nickname Lukuni after the hardwood used by the natives to make clubs or cudgels known as knobkerries. As well as being a pun on his name, this honorific referred to his toughness and resolve on the battlefield. Resourceful and self-reliant, he was perfect for the kind of independent command that he would undertake in the Zulu War, although he had an occasional tendency to take excessive risks. At 39, Buller was only a year younger than Wood, but the pair were worlds apart in character and appearance. Buller was tall and gaunt, with a long nose and piercing eyes. Queen Victoria said of him, quote, "He is reserved and shy, with a rather dry, gruff manner," end quote. But Buller's frosty exterior concealed a very capable mind and a genuine concern for his men, both factors that made him a very popular commander. After serving in multiple campaigns in Africa and China, Buller impressed Wolseley on his Canadian Red River expedition in 1870, displaying his singular combination of roughness and thoroughness. Having passed through the Staff College, Buller went on to serve as Wolseley's Chief of Intelligence in the Ashanti campaign, before being transferred to South Africa. It was as a commander of a corps of irregular cavalry in the aforementioned Cape Frontier War, however, where Buller really found his niche. He was a bold and tireless rider who led from the front by sheer force of personality. His fault, though, was an incredibly short temper. He once beat a war correspondent with a horsewhip after the journalist admitted to reading his personal mail. So now we know a bit about the relevant commanders. Let's get back to the invasion of Zululand. As we covered, Wood and his men crossed the Blood River on the 6th of January, and facing him was the shortest route of the three columns, just 75 miles between him and the Zulu capital of Ulundi, where the three columns were set to converge. Considering this fact, and Chelmsford's orders to thoroughly pacify the surrounding mountainous country, controlled by the fiercely pro-Ketchwayo Abakuluzi tribe, Wood was in no hurry. He advanced slowly, and set up a camp on a hill in the disputed territory known as Bemba's Kop. From there, he sent Buller's irregular horse out to raid for cattle, capturing 2,500 head in a few days. Cattle were, and often still are, the way wealth was measured by the pastoral natives of South Africa. The more cows one has, the higher status one is. On the 19th of January, after his peace terms were rejected by the Abakuluzi, he moved his camp to Thinter's Kraal as a preliminary to the opening of hostilities with this fierce mountain people. Before we get to the battle itself, we should look at the troops under Wood's command. He'd crossed the Blood River with just over 2,000 men, the smallest of the three columns. 1,500 redcoats from the 13th and 90th Light Infantry Regiments, 300 mostly Swazi auxiliaries known as Wood's Irregulars, 100 artillerymen manning 4 7-pounder mountain cannon from the 11 7th Battery, Royal Artillery, and 200 irregular cavalry. The cavalry is of particular interest, as, in the absence of any Imperial cavalry regiments in South Africa, the invasion forces had to make do with a ragtag collection of mounted policemen, volunteers from infantry regiments, and irregular corps like the Frontier Light Horse, Buller's unit, who were mounted on sturdy Basuto ponies, dressed in primitive uniform and armed with unwieldy carbines. Recruited mostly from the second sons of farmers and rangers from the African frontier, these men were crack shots, excellent riders, and in possession of expert knowledge of the terrain and their enemy, making them highly prized by the various column commanders. Wood's column was also unique in that it was accompanied by Piet Uys, a leading Utrecht Boer, and 40 of his followers, mounted Dutch voortrekkers who, rather like Beorn from The Hobbit, hated the English but hated their Zulu neighbours more. The redcoats under Wood's command were clad in their namesake scarlet jackets and blue trousers, as well as white cork sun helmets. Light, effective kit that was a far cry from the stiff tunics and heavy shakos of the Napoleonic era. They were also armed with the new breech-loading Martini Henry rifle, a beast of a firearm that fired a large caliber bullet at around 400 meters per second. This, for context, is enough force to stop a buffalo or take off your arm if it hits you. These weapons brought new deadliness to the British infantry, accurate up to 1,000 yards in the hand of a trained soldier, and with a fire rate of about 12 rounds per minute. Battalion volleys started at between 600 and 800 yards and were lethal. It was not perfect, however. The square-cut grooves in the barrel were liable to foul, and this, combined with the coarse powder used, created a vicious recoil that could break noses and certainly resulted in bruised shoulders. The thin, rolled brass cartridges also tended to melt and stick in the chamber, causing the gun to jam. Officers were armed with the fairly standard Colt revolvers and swords, although these were rarely used. Wood's Swazi irregulars were armed in the manner of their Zulu enemies, with a cowhide shield, assegai, and knobkerrie. 1 in 10 African auxiliaries were issued with rifles, mostly obsolete muzzle-loading Enfields. The white officers and NCOs that led the auxiliaries, however, were armed in the imperial manner, and rarely let their native troops use the firearms, because the lack of drill on the auxiliaries' part made them more likely to kill one another or themselves than the enemy. So now we've covered Wood's troops, let's get back to the narrative. After a few minor skirmishes with the local Zulu tribes, Wood sent Buller to scout out the mountainous country on the 19th of January, in preparation for a battle with the Abakhuluzi. Buller set out with his irregular horse and found a large force of Zulus, about 4,000 he estimated, on the plateaued top of a hill known as Zungwini and the neighbouring peak of Hlobane. Realising that he was hopelessly outnumbered, and having already lost several horsemen to the depredations of Zulu Snipers in the caves of the mountainside, Buller retreated, lest he fall victim to the usual Zulu tactic of the horns of the buffalo, where a large body of Zulus, known as the chest, engaged the enemy, while 2 formidable flanking forces, known as the horns, encircle and cut off the rear to eradicate them. The reserve was referred to as the loins. The Abakhuluzi pursued Buller's men down the mountain and back across the White Umflozi River, where several hundred of the more brave and foolish Zulus crossed to give chase. After sending a note to Wood to inform him of the events, Buller and his men turned on and charged the small party of Zulus, driving them back towards the river with heavy losses. On the 20th, Wood advanced towards Hlobane with a significant portion of his men, namely the entirety of the 90th Light Infantry, 2 of his 6 guns, and the remainder of his mounted troops. The force bivouacked at the foot of the eastern end of Zungwini, where they were joined by the 13th Light Infantry and 2 more guns, and in the early hours of the 24th, Wood led his force towards the central plateau of Hlobane with the intention of clearing it. As they marched towards the summit, the British once again came under fire from Zulus, hidden in the caves and rocks of the mountain, and Wood ordered his men up the mountain in pursuit, leaving 2 companies of the 90th and 2 of his cannon at the foot to guard the baggage. The men advancing up the mountain consisted of the 13th Light Infantry, 2 guns, and a handful of mounted troops, mostly Uyas's Boers. Wood rode at the head of the body of men, with his staff, and was not impressed with the Boers. He recalled, and I apologise for the length of this quote, but Wood's recollection here is excellent, quote, "It was necessary for Peart and myself to ride in front of the Boers, to induce them to advance at all. When we reached the rocks from which the fire had come, it was clear we could not hope to get the guns down, so, after driving back a few Zulus who were in broken ground, I turned north, towards where I had ordered the 90th to halt with the wagons. When I got there, the 90th was 3/4 of a mile in front, advancing rapidly in line, but without any support, against some 4,000 Zulus. I looked at the ravine and was concerned to see about 200 Zulus coming down it towards the 90th's ammunition carts, which had been left with some unarmed buglers." End quote. At this point, Wood ordered Buller's horsemen, who were a short distance away, to charge up the ravine against those 200 Zulus threatening the ammunition carts, whilst he himself galloped over to the 90th to berate their commanding officer for advancing, without support or orders, against a body of the enemy and leaving his rear and ammunition supplies unguarded. Fortunately for the men of the 90th, the Zulus chose not to engage after the first volley, and retreated up the mountain, pursued by the now united cavalry under Buller and Uyas. Wood, his position now secure, reunified his forces and marched to the Khambula mountain, on which he established a camp on the 30th of January. Now the fate of the other 2 columns becomes relevant. Pearson's column had reached Ashoe after fighting a battle en route, and were under siege there by the 22nd. On the same day, Chelmsford's column had suffered a major setback at Isandlwana, when half of the force he had left to guard his camp was surrounded and annihilated by a huge Zulu army, resulting in one of the most humiliating defeats in British military history. Furthermore, the Zulu success assaulting and overwhelming the fortified position of Isandlwana imbued them with confidence that will be important when they debate assaulting Wood's fortified camp at Khambula. In light of these events, the original invasion plan went out of the window, as Chelmsford sent the remnants of his force to relieve Pearson at Eshowe. To keep the pressure on the Zulus, he authorised Wood to, quote, attempt any offensive operations that you think fit to undertake, end quote. Undeterred by his previous failure, and bolstered by new native allies from the desertion of Prince Hamu, the eldest brother of King Cetshwayo, as well as the arrival of a large number of volunteer cavalry units and a rocket battery from Chelmsford's battered force at Isandlwana, Wood resolved to take the Abergwalusi on and evict them from their mountain stronghold atop Hlobane on the 28th of March. Hlobane was not a particularly high mountain, standing at a mere 1,500 feet, but it was formidable, with cliffs and rocky outcrops rendering most approaches impassable to cavalry or line infantry, and capable of sheltering, as we have seen, large numbers of Zulu Snipers. Moreover, it consisted of two plateaus, the upper and the lower, linked by a steep and rocky path that formed a natural choke point that could be easily defended. As Saul David puts it, quote, a less suitable ground for cavalry is difficult to imagine, end quote. Wood also had barely any intelligence, which was unusual for him, as he is considered foremost amongst commanders of his time for intelligence gathering, unlike the moronic Chelmsford. He didn't know how many men defended Hlobane, his estimate being between 1,000 and 4,000, and he had very little knowledge of the terrain and just how unsuitable it was for mounted operations. His aforementioned tendency to take unnecessary risks is foremost here, as he chooses to assault the mountain anyway, although it is worth noting that in his letters to Chelmsford, he shows that he had a strong inkling, and one that would prove correct, that Cetshwayo would send the main Zulu impi, or army, against the camp at Khambula, and thus Wood was keen to eliminate the threat to his left flank that the Abergwalusi at Hlobane posed, before engaging the main impi. The plan was for Colonel Buller, at the head of 400 horsemen, a rocket battery, and 1 battalion of Wood's Swazis, to ascend the eastern end of Hlobane, whilst Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Russell, the recently arrived overall commander of the invasion's cavalry, took 300 horsemen and a 2nd battalion of Swazis as far up the western end of the mountain as he could, quote, without incurring severe loss, end quote. The idea was to use the Zulus' tactics against them, engage them with a strong force, in this case Buller, whilst a smaller force, in this case Russell, raced around the flank to cut the enemies off and hit them in the rear. Buller was the hammer and Russell the anvil. The regular infantry remained at Khambula, as Wood feared they would not be able to march back from Hlobane in time to meet the impi, which was predicted to arrive at Khambula on the 29th, the day after the assault on the Abergwalusi. In terms of numbers, Buller had 705 men under his command, 396 horsemen, 300 Swazis, and 9 artillerymen. Russell had fewer horsemen, only 206, but more Swazis, 440, so 646 men in total. Because he had further to travel, Buller and his men departed first, leaving Khambula at 8 o'clock on the 27th of March, and pretended to make camp far to the south of Hlobane, lighting fires and pitching spare tents as part of a ruse to convince the Zulus that he was moving away from the mountain and further towards Ulundi. In reality, he was moving to a bivouac at the southern foot of Zangwini, 6 miles south of the Abergwalusi stronghold. It was during this manoeuvre that Buller lost contact with one of his corps of irregular cavalry, Colonel Frederick Weatherly's 54 men of the Border Horse. One of their number would later claim that Weatherly never received the order to move from the false camp to the real one, and as such they arrived at Hlobane late. This will become relevant. Russell's command left Khambula at 1 p.m. on the 27th and marched for 15 miles to a bivouac 5 miles to the west of Hlobane, accompanied by Wood and his staff. Before he retired for the night, Wood had a long conversation with Piet Uyes, the Boer. He recalled, quote, Uyes was confident that Colonel Buller would get up without serious loss, and we agreed that, except in the probable contingency of the Zulu main army coming in sight, our operation ought to be a success. Then Piet turned to me, saying, and Wood is quoting now, Colonel, if you are killed, I will take care of your children, and if I am killed, you must do the same for mine. End quotes. Wood agreed to this pact and went on to speak to one of the white officers of his Swazi battalion, a man who knew the terrain well. The officer assured him that, in the event of a retreat, the cavalry would definitely be able to descend the slopes of Hlobane as long as they led their horses. This, ladies and gentlemen, is called foreshadowing. Buller and his men, less Weatherly and his border horse, which was still missing, set off from their camp at 3 in the morning on the 28th, and soon reached the narrow goat track that led up the eastern end of Hlobane. They were fortunate in that the morning was very misty, and thus, despite their slow progress leading their horses, they had nearly reached the summit by the time the Zulu Snipers opened fire. The ruse had clearly worked, as opposing them were just a few sentries hidden in the rocks. Buller sent after them his own unit, the Frontier Light Horse, who cleared the rocks at a cost of 3 men, 2 officers and a trooper. The Swazis were then sent up the remaining distance, and, according to their commanding officer, Major William Knox Leet, they, quote, swarmed up the hill with a praiseworthy courage and rapidity, end quote. This was testament to the superiority of Wood's Swazis over the far less reliable Natal natives that served with the other columns, who were liable to desert or rout at the slightest provocation. Now you'll recall I mentioned that Hlobane was comprised of 2 plateaus, connected by a thin, precipitous path called a neck. Well, after a few minutes of fighting, the remaining sentries were driven back across the eastern plateau and down the western one. Buller had taken the upper plateau, but was not pleased with what he found. Quote, I was horrified as to the size of the place and its impracticability. A cursory inspection showed only 3 clear ways off the top. End quote. Those 3 ways were the path he had ascended up, a second path that led down the northeast, and a track to the northwest of the mountain that bridged the 2 plateaus. This last path was dubbed the Devil's Path, and Buller wrote of the latter 2 routes, quote, both of them were paths that no man in cold blood would ever try to get a horse down, end quote. The Devil's Pass was little more than a cliff, with several narrow shelves leading down the steep rocky face towards the lower plateau, upon which the Aberqualusi had congregated. Buller busied himself collecting up the stray cattle that were dotted around as he waited for Russell to get into position. Now he had left his bivouac at about 4 in the morning, reaching the foot of the lower mountain at dawn. By 6:30, his Swazis had fought their way to the summit, and he quickly joined them, where he was informed that Buller had taken the upper mountain, and in response he set off with a small party of horsemen to speak to the colonel, sending his men out to gather cattle. He recalled, quote, I at once moved with a small party of men to try and communicate with Colonel Buller, while the rest of my column came up the hill. I was fired at, and my escort returned fire. I heard Colonel Buller shout, bring your men up to fire, or words to that effect. I sent back to bring the rest of the force, which quickly arrived. Captain Brown was then sent across the neck to the upper plateau in order to find out, if possible, if assistance was required from me by Colonel Buller, and just generally what was the situation. End quote. It is worth noting, at this point, that Russell had a reputation for incompetence and idiocy. When he was named overall commander of cavalry, most of the mounted forces taking part in the invasion threatened to mutiny, and only the threat of resignation on behalf of the aforementioned Captain Brown, the beloved commander of the Imperial Mounted Infantry, persuaded the cavalrymen to stay. In fact, Wood had already requested Russell be transferred to a different column, but Chelmsford, who liked Russell personally, refused. Evidence of the Lieutenant Colonel's incompetence can be found at Hlobane, when he seemingly ignored his orders from Wood to take the western end of the upper plateau, and his orders from Buller to bring his men up the eastern side and fire down on the Aberqualusi below. His reason for this ignorance was that he considered the path that connected the lower plateau on which he was to the upper plateau occupied by Buller impassable by cavalry, which it probably was. This, however, does not provide adequate excuse for his inaction, for 2 reasons. Firstly, he could have sent his Swazis or ordered cavalry to lead their horses, as Brown and 20 of his IMI had done. And secondly, he should have attempted to find a workaround, rather than just passively loitering on the lower plateau looking for cows. Here, Wood rejoins our narrative. He had set off slightly earlier than Russell that morning, at the head of a tiny party. His 3 staff officers, Captain the Honourable Ronald Campbell, Lieutenant Harry Lysons, and Llewellyn Lloyd, Wood's civilian interpreter, accompanied him, as well as a minuscule escort of 8 mounted infantrymen and 7 mounted Zulus, under the command of Prince Cap'n Panday, another brother of Cetshwayo, who'd sided with the British. En route to Hlobane, he had run into Weatherly and his border horse, who were going in the opposite direction of the clearly visible mountain, and who gave Wood the lame excuse that they were lost. He, in turn, ordered them to follow him towards the sound of firing, audible from the northeast end of the mountain. They began their ascent, but quickly came under fire, and Weatherly and his men took cover in the rocks. An infuriated Wood rode past the cowering horsemen and up the slope, followed by just 6 of the border horse brave enough to follow him. The terrain soon forced the small party to dismount, and they continued up the mountain on foot, leaving their horses in the ruins of a kraal halfway up the mountainside. Wood, however, whose frailty made him a poor walker, continued to lead his horse. As they neared the summit, the party came under heavy fire from Zulus atop the plateau, and the border horse, nearer the foot, returned fire, causing Lloyd to remark, quote, "I am glad of that, for it will make the Zulus shoot badly." End quote. Immediately after finished this fate-tempting remark, he was hit in the spine by a Zulu sniper, causing an injury so bad he was left in the kraal with the horses. Next to fall was Wood's horse, which was shot in the head and fell down the steep slope, knocking the colonel over and causing him to tumble down to near the bottom. He insisted he was unhurt, however, and scrambled back up towards the summit and his comrades, pausing to check on Lloyd, who subsequently died in his arms. When he rejoined his escort, Wood sent Captain Campbell down to where Weatherly and his timorous men were still hiding, with an order to clear the cave from which most of the fire was coming. Wood recalled, quote, "He received the order 3 times, but would not leave the cover where he was sheltering." End quote. Campbell quickly gave up and charged up the slope, shouting, quote, "Damn him, the coward! I'll turn those Zulus out myself." End quote. Half of Wood's escort followed him, namely Lieutenant Lysons and 4 of the mounted infantry, with the surviving 4 men remaining with Wood in the shelter of the kraal. The 6 men reached the cave unharmed, but, upon entering, a Zulu shot Campbell in the head at such close range that the round took off his head. Lysons and a private Fowler leapt over Campbell's corpse and cleared the cave, an action for which they were both awarded the Victoria Cross. Wood later attempted to have Campbell awarded with a VC, but posthumous awards were not allowed until 1920. In 2 minutes, Wood had lost 2/3 of his staff, and the loss of Campbell, whom Wood loved like a son, was a particularly heavy blow, and its impact is visible in that Wood decided to bury the 2 fallen officers there and then, despite the heavy Zulu fire. He sent his bugler down to retrieve his Bible from the saddlebags of his dead horse, an act of madness in itself, and Wood seemed to lose his mind further when he ordered graves be dug, with assegais in the absence of a spade, then berated his men for digging the trenches too short so the men could not lie flat. When 200 Zulus crossed the neck and began to approach, Wood still refused to halt his insane ceremony and read the burial service in full over the graves, despite heavy Zulu sniper fire. Fortunately for the entire party, Buller had seen the danger Wood was in, and had dispatched a few of his men to open fire on those 200 Zulus, causing them to scatter and run for cover. The ceremony eventually finished, and Weatherly, perhaps seeking to salvage some shred of honour, volunteered to lead his men down the hill to retake the track up which Buller had ascended, as it had been retaken by Zulus. Wood decided to move around the base of the mountain to check on Russell. In the meanwhile, Buller had gathered more than 2,000 cattle and had been skirmishing across the plateau for a while in an attempt to prevent the Aberqualusi from mustering and attacking as one force. As the fighting grew more fierce, however, he was forced to bring his force together at the eastern end of the mountain, lest the Zulus destroy his isolated skirmishing detachments one by one. There, they came under heavy attack from the reinforced and rallied warriors, and that was just the start of the difficulties for the British force. Buller's scouts reported to him sightings of the main Zulu Army in the valley beneath the south side of Hlobane. A second column of 5 regiments had been dispatched from this main army to cut off the eastern side of the mountain and the path up which Buller had ascended. He described the situation after the fact in a letter to his aunt. Quote, "We were 30 miles from camp. Our horses had been under saddle since 3 a.m. It was then 10 a.m. and they had had nothing to eat since the previous morning. I saw we had not a chance of coming back the way we had come." End quote. So to sum up, because this battle is chaotic and complicated, the situation at the moment is thus. Russell and his men are on the lower plateau, doing very little and unaware of the main Zulu army. Buller and his men are trapped on the upper plateau by this main army and under heavy assault from the remaining Abakhuluzi, and Wood is moving around the base of the mountain from Buller's position to Russell's. Weatherly is leading his now reduced command of 41 men to secure the path up which Buller had advanced, oblivious to the fact that this path is occupied by a large detachment of Zulus from Cetshwayo's main army. When he reached the path, Weatherly decided, surprise, surprise, to withdraw. But on his way back to the plateau, he met Captain Barton, one of Buller's best men, who'd been sent with 30 mounted men to secure the south side of the mountain. When they realised how outnumbered they were, they made for the Ityenka Neck, the route down Hlobane and across the ridge between it and the next mountain. Weatherly decided to join him, and the 70 or so horsemen attempted to cross the saddle of land under a heavy crossfire from Abakhuluzi on the plateau and Zulus from the main army. They descended the, quote, "extremely steep succession of precipitous ledges," end quote, that made up the neck, as Zulu warriors closed in on them and the fire and assegais began to take their toll. Nearly 50 of the party were killed in the descent, including Weatherly and his 14-year-old son. The roughly 20 men who survived were pursued over the open country by a great many Zulus. Their horses exhausted and the country unfavourable to them, the majority of the survivors were chased down and killed, including Barton. The accounts of this harrowing chase come from one of the few who made it back to the camp, Captain Dennison of the Border Horse, and a Zulu warrior who took part in the pursuit, named Sitsit Shili. Wood, meanwhile, had been intercepted on his way round the mountain by a scout, who told him of their encirclement by the Zulu army. He sent his only surviving staff officer, Lieutenant Lysons, to Russell with an order to move his force to the Zungwin Neck, the area that linked Hlobane to the first peak in the trio that made up the mountain range. From this position, he could keep open the routes down the slope of the lower plateau, which was much more passable, and thus cover Buller's retreat. Russell's ineptitude again rears its head, because he misunderstood the order and moved instead to the opposite side of Hlobane, to the neck that connected it to the third peak, an area with very few Zulus and 6 miles away from Buller, whom Russell knew to be trapped on the upper plateau. Wood was vicious in his assault on Russell after the fact, insinuating that cowardice was the true cause of his perverse manoeuvre, as any idiot could see that moving to an area miles away from your stranded comrades and allowing the only safe route by which they can retreat to fall into enemy hands is not the correct decision. Buller and Lieutenant Brown were even more brutal in their attacks on Russell. After all, he had left them high and dry on the upper shelf of Hlobane, from whence their only escape was down the Devil's Pass, a route perilous enough, even if Russell had been there to hold the lower shelf. As it was, Buller and his men had to make this treacherous descent under constant fire, and then fight their way off the pass and onto the lower peak, whilst Russell once again sat twiddling his thumbs miles away from where he should have been. Most of the trapped force made it to the top of the pass, ably protected by a rearguard led by Brown, whom Russell had abandoned with Buller, and the Frontier Light Horse. Major Knox Leet, the commander of the Swazi contingent of Buller's column, led his men on the descent first. He remembered, quote, "It was an almost perpendicular cliff, composed of extremely irregular boulders and very narrow. With so many men and horses to go down, the operation would have been very difficult at the best of times, but with the enemy pressing us, it appeared almost impossible." End quote. For a time, whilst Brown and his rearguard held out, the retreat went fine and in good order. A fair few men made it to the bottom, including Buller himself, although the majority of the mounted contingent had lost their horses. Very quickly, however, the rearguard were overwhelmed. Buller says the reason for their collapse was that they mistook a large group of Zulus for Swazis and allowed them to get in amongst the fugitives streaming down the pass. They quickly turned, however, and the rearguard was surrounded and broke. A swarm of warriors then beset those British still atop the upper plateau and set at them with assegais. Because of the close confines of the pass, combat was difficult for Buller's men, whose unwieldy carbines and swords were next to useless in the cramped conditions. As more people rushed down the pass away from the bloodthirsty Zulus, some unlucky men and horses tumbled off the rocks and to their deaths, and any semblance of armed resistance failed, save Buller and those mounted men who still had horses, who had rallied at the bottom of the descent and who stopped the Zulus in their tracks. 17 men died in the descent, including Piet Uys, who had reached the bottom safely but had climbed back up the pass to rescue his son. His son survived, but Uys was assegaied in the back. Remember Wood's pact with Uys to look after one another's children. Well, Wood made good on his promises and requested that 36,000 acres of government land be distributed amongst the Boer's 9 children. He later brought this request to the Queen, who ensured it was carried out. The ordeal for the rest of Buller's men was far from over, however. They descended the much more forgiving slope of the lower plateau, but were pursued all the way by Aberqualusi irregulars, who killed several of the fugitives as they fled. The fleet-footed Zulus had the advantage over this broken ground, and the fact that less than half of the horsemen still had horses certainly didn't help matters. Buller personally saved the lives of at least 3 men by riding to the back of his column and picking up stragglers on the back of his own horse, delivering them one at a time to the relative safety of the front of the pack, an action which contributed to his winning of the Victoria Cross for this engagement. Only when the battered force reached Russell's position on the Zungwin Neck were they truly safe. Russell, however, was at greater risk from an enraged Buller than he had ever been from the Zulus. Buller told Wood that, quote, "I'll be damned if I will ever serve with Russell again," end quote. Russell's lame excuse for his actions was that, quote, "my métier is not in South African fighting," end quote. It seems to me that his métier was not in fighting at all, but in hiding and ignoring orders. At Wood's vehement request, Russell was demoted and assigned to the backseat role of commanding the remount depot. Not even his friendship with Chelmsford could save him from the hatred of so many well-respected officers and men. Wood and his tiny party remained on the Zungwin Neck until 7 p.m, so he could look out for any stragglers and fugitives and guard the rear, an admirable duty for a commander to take on himself. Buller eventually returned to the neck, looking for him, as the two had lost contact and feared one another dead. They exchanged heartfelt compliments and commiserations for the battle and returned to the camp at Khambula. Buller had not reached the camp when he was called back to Hlobane to rescue some trapped men, which he did with little opposition. He was tired, having gone without sleep for 2 days, and his horse was exhausted, but he undertook the rescue personally nonetheless, hoping beyond hope that one of the men stranded was the aforementioned Captain Barton, who had been one of his closest friends and best subordinates. It turned out to be Captain Dennison and the 6 survivors of Weatherly's border horse, who revealed to Buller Barton's tragic fate. Russell's captured cattle never made it back to Khambula. They were recaptured when the force escorting them, 2 white officers and over 100 Swazis, ran straight into the Zulu Army that was on its way to the mountain. The escort was annihilated to a man. The total casualties for the British at Hlobane were 225 men killed and 8 wounded. Wood had suffered the loss of many of his horses, 2/3 of his staff, and with Uys dead, the remaining Boers deserted sometime in the night. Hlobane may have been a complete disaster for the British, but the 2 attempts to storm the stronghold completed their most important aims. The first provoked Cetshwayo into sending his main army away from Chelmsford's knackered force, which it would likely have annihilated. The second provided a diversion, whilst Chelmsford moved to relieve Pearson's besieged column at Eshowe. The Hlobane affairs also led the Zulus right to the heavily fortified camp at Khambula, where they will mount an assault on the 29th, but I'll save that for the next episode. Before we wrap up for today, I just want to engage in some shameless self-promotion. There is a Patreon you can use to support the show, and it has a bunch of very respectable perks for those who choose to do so, not least a series of bonus episodes on conflicts too short to warrant their own episode. Patrons of all ranks will get a shout-out at the end of episodes, so if you want to join the Obscure Fare rank and file and win my undying gratitude, go to patreon.com/obscurefare. That's the self-promotion over, and for now I'll say thank you for listening to the first proper episode of Obscure Fare. I do hope you stick around, and I look forward to making many subsequent ones. Remember to tune in to the episode on the Battle of Khambula, which should be coming out next week sometime, and make sure you follow the show so you never miss an episode. Thanks again, and I hope you have a good day.